Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
Today, we're diving into the psychology of voting.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we're really going to try to uncover those, hidden forces that shape how we make decisions in the voting booth.
Right, right.
And you might even learn a few things about yourself along the way.
I like it.
So,
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that's always fascinated me about this topic
yeah.
is how often we like to think about voting being this uh, purely rational process.
Right.
Like we carefully weigh all of the issues,
Of course.
and then we choose the candidate that perfectly aligns with, what we believe. But
No.
um, the reality is much more complicated than that.
Oh, you're telling me.
Yeah.
Have you ever, sat down to fill out a sample ballot and been like, who even am I?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So what's really going on in our brains when we're faced with these, big election decisions?
Well, so our brains are incredible at processing information. I mean, they're really good at it, but they're also masters of efficiency.
Okay.
So they love to take shortcuts,
Yep.
especially when we're talking about something as complex as an election.
Yeah.
And these shortcuts, they're called cognitive biases.
Okay.
And they can be incredibly influential in how we make decisions, often without us even realizing it.
Cognitive biases, okay. It's like those little pop-up ads in the back of our minds.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
But instead of trying to sell us something, it's like they're trying to mess with our voting decisions.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. They're like these pre-programmed responses
Yeah.
that really help us navigate the world, quickly.
Right.
But just like any shortcut, they can kind of lead us down some interesting paths,
Yeah.
especially when you're in the voting booth.
Okay. I'm hooked.
Yeah.
So let's say an election is coming up.
Right.
Where do these biases, where do they first come into play?
Okay. So imagine you're, scrolling through your social media feed and suddenly everyone is talking about this upcoming local election.
Right.
You see the news articles, the opinion pieces, your
Yeah.
friends are having these, passionate debates about the candidates. It's everywhere you look.
Right.
This is where the availability heuristic comes into play.
Okay. Availability heuristic.
Okay.
I feel like that's something I should know, but I need a little refresher. What is that exactly?
Sure. Yeah. The availability heuristic is essentially our tendency to judge the importance
Okay.
or the likelihood of something
Yeah.
based on how easily those examples come to mind.
Okay.
So in this case, because this local election is so prominent in our social media world,
Right.
our brains might decide that it's a much bigger deal than it actually is,
Wow.
simply because those examples are readily available.
Wow. Okay. That's kind of scary when you think about it. It's like our brains are just going, well, if I see it everywhere, it must be important.
Exactly. Yeah.
But what about those smaller, lesser known elections that don't get as much attention? It's almost like we might just completely underestimate them just because they're not, constantly in our faces on our social feeds.
That's exactly right. And it really highlights how our perception of what's important can be totally skewed by factors that have nothing to do with the actual significance of the election itself.
Right. Right. It's almost like our brains are playing a trick on us.
Right.
Making us think that something is a bigger deal than it is just because it's, it's getting more airtime. And
Yeah.
and all of this happens even before we even start thinking about the candidates themselves.
Precisely. And once we do start forming these opinions about the candidates, another bias kicks in, the halo effect.
Okay.
Have you ever noticed
The halo effect. Okay.
how a single positive trait, like a warm smile or a charming personality, can make you view someone more favorably overall?
Oh, 100%. It's like, that one friend we all have who could get away with anything
Right.
just because they have that certain charisma. But this happens in politics too.
Absolutely. The halo effect can be incredibly powerful in shaping our perceptions of political candidates.
Okay.
We might unconsciously assume that a candidate who seems, likable or trustworthy
Right.
must also be competent and intelligent, even if we have no real evidence to support those assumptions.
So if a candidate walks onto that stage and they've got the perfect hair, the dazzling smile,
Right.
our brains might just automatically fill in the blanks and be like, oh yeah, and they're also an expert on the economy.
Right. Foreign policy and everything else.
It might sound simplistic,
Yeah.
but it's a very real phenomenon. Our brains are wired to make quick judgments, and often, those judgments are based on superficial factors rather than a deep dive into a candidate's qualifications.
Okay. So we've got the availability heuristic influencing what we pay attention to,
Right.
and we've got the halo effect shaping our first impressions.
Yeah.
This is starting to feel less like a rational decision-making process and more like we're being swayed by our own brains.
It's true, but understanding these biases is the first step
Yeah.
toward recognizing when they might be influencing our choices.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of our own minds
Right.
to see how they work.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves here,
Sure.
I want to pause for a second.
Yeah.
What have we learned so far about how our brains react when an election rolls around?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think so far we've uncovered that our brains like to rely on these mental shortcuts to navigate, the complexities of elections.
Right.
We talked about how the availability heuristic can shape how we view the importance of an election.
Yeah, yeah.
Based on how often we encounter information about it.
Right.
And then there's the halo effect where a candidate's, likability can totally overshadow their other qualities.
Right. It's like our brains are trying to simplify things.
Yeah.
But those simplifications aren't always accurate or fair. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of our perception of a candidate is as actually based on their policies and their experience
Right.
versus just vibes.
It's a great point. And it actually brings us to another fascinating bias, confirmation bias.
Okay.
So you see, once we've, kind of formed that initial impression of a candidate,
Right.
our brains love to then seek out information that confirms those existing beliefs,
Oh, okay.
even if those beliefs are, based on shaky ground.
Oh, I totally do this. It's like when you buy a certain brand of coffee and then suddenly all you see are positive reviews about it online.
Exactly.
Even though, realistically, there have to be at least some people out there who aren't that impressed.
Confirmation biases, it's everywhere. It's like we have these invisible filters on our minds
Yeah.
that block out anything that contradicts what we already believe
Right.
and amplifies everything that supports it.
Wow. So if we've already decided that we like a particular candidate because, let's just say, I don't know, they gave a really inspiring speech or something,
Right.
we might be more likely to just completely overlook any negative news stories about them or any criticism as just being, attacks from the other side.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works.
Wow.
We tend to just interpret information in a way that reinforces our existing beliefs,
Right.
even if those beliefs are not, totally objective or well-founded.
It's like we've already made up our minds.
Right.
And we're just searching for evidence to support what we've already decided.
Right.
And all this before we've even really looked into their policies or their track record.
Exactly. Now imagine you're scrolling through, your news feed and you see a headline about your favorite candidate. Maybe they made a mistake or they're facing some sort of challenge.
Right.
How do you react to that?
Well, if I'm being totally honest with myself, I'd probably try to downplay it.
Right.
I might even try to rationalize it in my head.
Yeah.
Be like, well, everyone makes mistakes, or oh, they were probably just tired that day.
And that brings us to another bias, the intentionality bias.
So it's basically our tendency to assume that a person's actions are always intentional,
Okay.
especially when those actions have, negative consequences.
Right.
So even if your candidate's mistake or misstep was, totally honest or just a result of factors outside of their control,
Right.
your brain might be wired to see it as, as a deliberate choice.
Okay. That's kind of unsettling.
Yeah.
So instead of giving those candidates the benefit of the doubt, we might just be attributing all sorts of ulterior motives
Right.
to their actions, even if those motives don't actually exist.
It's a very human tendency
Yes.
to want to understand, to find an explanation for why things happen, right?
Right.
Especially when those things are, unexpected or unpleasant.
Right. But yeah, this bias, it can definitely lead us down some pretty twisty paths, especially in politics where every single action is just put it under a microscope.
It's like we're turning every election into a game of Clue,
Right,
trying
exactly.
to figure out like who did it and what their secret agenda was, even when sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one.
Right. And it's not even just about, assigning blame or judging character.
Right.
It also influences how we interpret, their policies and their positions.
So you're saying that even when we finally get to the point where we are ready to look at the actual issues,
Right.
those pesky little biases are still like lurking in the shadows.
I'm afraid so. So remember that availability heuristic we were talking about earlier?
Right.
It actually plays a big role here, too.
Okay.
Issues that are, highly visible and constantly being discussed
Right.
or are really emotionally charged, they tend to carry more weight in our minds,
Right.
even if they're not actually, the most pressing or the most relevant to our own lives.
So if everyone's talking about, let's say, education reform, for example,
Right.
we might prioritize a candidate's stance on that issue,
Yeah.
even if, let's say healthcare is a much bigger concern for us personally.
That's a great example. And here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
It's not that those other issues aren't important. It's just that our brains are kind of wired to pay attention to what's the most salient, what's right in front of us, what everyone else seems to be talking about.
So our own personal priorities might just get like totally drowned out by, the news cycle or whatever the latest trending topic is on social media.
Exactly.
How can we possibly make these rational decisions when we're like bombarded with information, from all sides like that?
That's the challenge, right?
Right.
And to make things even more complex,
Okay.
we haven't even touched on, the influence of our emotions,
Right.
our social groups,
Right.
and that whole thing, strategic voting.
Well, you've officially piqued my curiosity.
Yeah.
I definitely want to like dive a little deeper into those aspects of, the voter journey, but
Yeah.
but before we do,
Sure.
I think it's time for maybe a quick recap here.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone through how our brains kind of use these mental shortcuts, these cognitive biases, to figure out the complexities of elections.
Right.
We've seen how those biases can shape like how we see the candidates, the issues that we think are important, and even like how we interpret information.
Right.
But you know what? We haven't even like really gotten into, the whole strategic voting thing yet.
Right. Right. There's another layer to this whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah, strategic voting is fascinating because it's that moment when we stop thinking about just our own personal preferences.
Yeah.
And we kind of step back and look at the bigger picture of the election.
Right. It's like we all turn into these master chess players all of a sudden.
Yeah.
We're trying to like predict how everyone else is going to vote and how do we make the most impactful decision, even if it means, maybe not voting for our very top choice.
Exactly. And you know what? One of the things that drives these strategic decisions
Okay.
is a bias called loss aversion.
Okay, okay, yeah. Remind me about that one.
Okay. So imagine this. Let's say you're told that you have, like a 50% chance of losing $100.
Okay.
Now, how much would you need to win
Right.
to make that gamble feel, worthwhile to you?
Okay. I'd probably need the potential winnings to be a lot higher, right? Like maybe $200 or even more. It's like
Yeah.
that fear of losing that $100 is just like so much more powerful in my mind
Yeah.
than the thought of oh, but I might win it back.
You're exactly right. Loss aversion suggests that the pain of losing something is so much stronger,
Yeah.
Psychologically speaking, than the pleasure of gaining something that's, of equal value.
So in the context of like voting,
Right.
does that mean that we might be more likely to vote against a candidate that we really dislike, even if it means like voting for someone who wasn't like our top choice, just because like the thought of that other candidate potentially winning is just like too much to handle?
Precisely.
Wow.
We become so focused on preventing a negative outcome
Right.
that we're willing to compromise on our ideal choice just to minimize that risk.
Like we're playing defense instead of offense. We're just trying to like prevent the worst possible outcome, instead of actually like going for the win that we really want deep down.
That's a great way to put it. And this actually ties into another bias that that shapes how we vote strategically.
Okay.
It's called reactive devaluation.
Reactive devaluation.
Okay.
Okay.
So have you ever noticed how like a great idea will suddenly seem less appealing
Right.
if it's coming from someone that you don't agree with?
Oh, all the time.
Right.
It's like when, like, that coworker you have that you like disagree with on everything,
Right.
suddenly like have this great idea that
Right.
you were literally just thinking about, and then
Right.
all of a sudden we're like, well, is it actually that good of an idea?
You're questioning your own judgment.
Totally.
That's reactive devaluation.
Okay.
It's when we kind of automatically dismiss or devalue something
Right.
simply because it's being proposed by someone we see as, like an opponent.
Okay. So let's say, like, in an election,
Right.
this could mean that we're rejecting a policy that maybe we would actually agree with or support if it was
Right.
coming from, like, the party that we typically support.
Right.
But because it's being championed by, I don't know, a candidate or a party that we've kind of labeled in our minds as like the enemy, we're just totally against it.
Exactly.
Well,
We
you're right.
become so entrenched in those, those pre-existing like alliances and categories in our minds
Right.
that we might miss out on, actually finding some common ground
Yeah.
or some really good potential solutions just because they're coming from, quote unquote, the other side.
It's like we're letting our biases just like completely blind us to potential solutions and things that we might actually agree on,
Right.
just because we're so focused on beating the other side.
It's this very complex interplay of all these different things, right? And to make things even more interesting,
Right.
let's not forget about another bias that loves to make an appearance here.
Okay.
Overconfidence bias.
Overconfidence bias. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That feeling that we all get sometimes where we think we're like, more knowledgeable or better at predicting how things are going to turn out than we actually are, right?
Right.
But how does that play into strategic voting?
Well, think about those times when you're so sure
Right.
that your candidate is going to win.
Okay.
Maybe because like all your friends are supporting them or the polls look really good.
Right. Right.
That overconfidence can lead to complacency,
Right.
because people might, just stay home on election day because they think, oh, well, my vote's not needed. My candidate's a shoo-in.
Right. Right. It's like we're so busy like patting ourselves on the back for
Right.
being such like strategic masterminds
Right.
that we forget to actually like play the game.
Exactly. And that overconfidence can also lead us to just completely misjudge, how the electorate is feeling, right?
Right.
So we might make these strategic decisions based on, what we think other people are going to do,
Right.
but those assumptions might be totally wrong.
So we're not just battling our own biases.
Right.
We're also like trying to predict everyone else's biases and then outsmart them.
Yeah. It's a lot to think about.
It's exhausting.
Right.
So okay, we've uncovered all these biases,
Right.
but now we need to figure out how to actually combat these biases. Like, what can we do
Right.
to make sure that these biases aren't like hijacking our voting decisions?
Well, I think the first step, honestly, is awareness.
Yeah.
Just recognizing that these biases exist at all.
Right.
That they're hardwired into how we think.
Right.
Can help us to be, more critical of our own assumptions
Yeah.
and more open to hearing other perspectives.
It's like we're finally like turning the lights on
Yeah.
and we're seeing those shortcuts for what they really are.
Right.
Okay. But awareness on its own isn't like enough, right?
No, it's a great first step, but we also have to challenge those biases.
Right. Okay.
So seek out those different sources of information. Don't just surround yourself with people who already agree with you.
Right.
Right. Have those tough conversations
Yeah.
with people who have different perspectives.
So break out of those echo chambers.
Yeah.
And really like expose ourselves to different viewpoints,
Yeah.
even if those viewpoints make us a little bit uncomfortable.
It's not easy,
Right.
but it's so important for developing a more nuanced and informed perspective.
Yeah.
And when you do encounter those pieces of information that challenge what you believe,
Mhm.
don't just immediately dismiss them.
Right.
Really take some time to consider it. Ask yourself, like, why am I like feeling resistant to this information?
Right. Right. It's almost like giving our brains a workout, you know?
Totally.
We're pushing ourselves beyond those comfortable, thought patterns, those familiar thought patterns.
And then finally, I think one of the most important things is just to, remember that humility is key.
Yeah.
None of us are immune to this.
Right.
We all have those blind spots.
So approach the whole voting process with a healthy dose of humility,
Exactly.
recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. The more we can, adopt that kind of mindset, the more
Yeah.
open we become to learning and understanding and,
Right.
and ultimately to making those decisions that really are in line with our values.
This whole deep dive into the psychology of voting it's been really eye-opening. We've learned how those mental shortcuts, those biases that we all have,
Right.
can really influence our decisions in ways that we probably don't even realize are happening.
Right. But remember, awareness is power.
Yeah.
So by understanding these biases,
Yeah.
we can become more, more conscious, more informed, more engaged participants in democracy.
We really hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on those decisions that we make in the voting booth. Your vote is your voice, and it deserves to be heard.